Hi, and welcome to the Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Now, tonight we have Dominic Cardy, Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development with us. And tonight we're talking about education in the province. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dominic.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
Now, to get right into it, last week it was revealed that the government will be introducing a new French language training pilot project. Now, could you talk a bit about what that project is?
Sure. And actually, it's one of those sort of interesting stories around is the intersection between media and politics, because actually the announcement was made before Christmas. But for some reason, it didn't get any pickup at all.
Really?
What did get traction was the leader of another party announcing that French Immersion was going to be scrapped, which is about the best way you can set off a political firestorm in New Brunswick. So that led to a lot of the media that people saw last week. So what we're looking at doing is, right now we've got French Immersion that's been in place for decades. We've had a variety of other sort of late and early entry points for different language programs. But the problem we've consistently had is that most New Brunswickers, most Anglophone New Brunswickers, aren't bilingual and don't even have the ability to converse in our province's second language. And it's weird when you compare our numbers here to European countries where they often have 2 or 3 or even 4 languages being taught and an expectation that people will come out of school being able to certainly speak them, have some ability even to write them. And I think part of the problem in New Brunswick is because we've turned language into such a cultural and political issue. It's not, we don't have these fights about, should kids learn math? Do we have math immersion? I mean, it just doesn't happen. Of course, everyone should learn math. Make sure they've got the basics. So what we're trying to do is in a small number of schools, which are going to be self-identified, because we're not trying to push this on anyone, we're going to try and see if we can have one second language training program for all the students in that school to replace the multiple programs that we currently see in place. And we want to see whether that works or not. And be open to tweaking it as it goes along, which is why we're asking for schools that want to participate to volunteer so that we're, not imposing it. And the goal is to try and make sure we get more New Brunswickers able to speak both of our official languages. Learning a second language, it's good for your income. The more languages you speak, the more money you're going to make in life. It's good for your mental health. It's got all kinds of benefits. No reason not to do it. But too often I think we've shied away from talking about issues around language instruction because it ties into the political issues and people start going on about bilingualism and you hear all the stuff that we've unfortunately spent a lot of time talking about in New Brunswick politics. So my hope is that we'll have an evidence-based approach here that'll show us whether or not we can do this better. If we can't, we'll go back to doing it the old way. But my hope is that we can do better because I think there's always room for improvement. And after 50 years, I think that on the Anglophone side of the education system, we've got work to do to catch up to make sure that we can make sure our students are well prepared for a pretty complicated world where they need all the tools they can get.
Now, have any other programs or projects influenced this plan at all?
Well, we looked at the Flora program, which was a program that to give the previous government some credit, when the Gallant Liberals were in, one of the biggest criticisms of French Immersion is not so much the program itself. If you go through French Immersion, you get people talking, and it's absolutely the case, that against the program's own measurement matrices, it doesn't do a great job of graduating students who are at the level that the program claims it's supposed to be able to get them to. But still, most of the people who go through the program get to some level of being able to work in French, so that's good. But there's a whole lot of kids who've never been able to access French immersion. You get people, especially in rural parts of English New Brunswick, where immersion's never been offered. You tend to see a bias towards middle and upper income kids accessing immersion, so there's a bit of a class issue there as well. So there's a number of different factors that have made immersion a program that has never really reached out across the whole province. And now we're facing a challenge with a shortage of French language teachers. So when I went through immersion myself back I started in '76, there was a real focus on you got off the school bus in the morning and you spoke French from the first day. I think the first morning there was a couple of words in English, basically this is the last English you're going to hear, and then it was all French. And it was French on the playground, at recess, until you got in the school at the end of the day. And that's no longer the case because we don't have the resources to be able to support a program as intensive as that. So immersion itself has changed in the way that it can be defined. And we were now seeing, even in the French system, there's a shortage of French language teachers. So any French second language training programs are really suffering right now in terms of teacher access. So we're looking at how can we access new teachers. That's going to take some time. So the Gallant government, with their Flora program, tried to introduce French language in rural areas. And so far the results after just a couple of years look pretty positive. Part of the problem with education reforms is that anytime that you do anything, really it takes 12 years before you can get some sense, and really 20 years because you want to see how your cohort of students, when they graduate, what do they go off and do? Are they able to live the life they want to live? So trying to find the way of measuring some of these reforms is also has been a challenge, but certainly the initial results we're seeing there are pretty positive. And so again, my hope in these pilot schools, which will probably be around 12, that will have regular assessments all throughout the year, make sure that we're able to keep track to see whether we're moving up beyond the levels where we've seen with the other programs that are in place. So we're looking at all the programs that have been out there, looking at programs that are in place in other provinces and countries as well, because why shouldn't we try and learn from the best? We get people who come to New Brunswick and look at our immersion system. We should do the same thing. Sharing information only makes sense.
Now, when do you hope to get this program started?
September of this year. So that's the goal. So we're hoping to get, again, around 12 schools. And we'd initially been looking at starting with some elementary schools. Most of the projects tend to focus on that age group for obvious reasons. You're starting off the student's career in school. But I've had a number of middle and high school principals and teachers who've reached out and who are interested in trying this as well. And my approach on that is if people are interested in embracing change and figuring out ways that we can do things better, and again, in this case, hopefully achieve a more bilingual province, I want to work with them. So my goal is this fall, 12 schools focusing on elementary, but if we have some other schools involved, that's great too.
Are you able to disclose which schools have already volunteered to take part?
No, I wouldn't do that yet. Once we've got a full list and once it's all confirmed and set up, we've got the program details. But
now, is there advantage to gradually rolling out a program to try it versus changing it all at once, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of advantages. The first, in a democracy, if you want to really traumatize everyone, the best thing to do is say, yeah, dear people in New Brunswick, we're now going to make you all do this, and then just dump it on people. And also, you're really missing out on the opportunity to be more flexible and make an evidence-based decision. That you don't see medicines rolled out without having an extensive trial period. You don't see other areas of other products rolled out unless they've been safety tested and so on. And I think the same should really apply to education programs. So why wouldn't we try things out first? Make sure that the trials are done as carefully as possible, so you've got a broader range of schools as possible, given we're talking here about a universal program. But yeah, the goal is to start it out small, make sure that it works. And my goal is to have it so that the people who want to see their kids become bilingual, they choose to put their kids in a program like this. The same way that right now they're choosing to put their kids in a Flora program or in an immersion program. So that's the goal.
Now, the French Immersion program has come under heavy criticism for the last decade or so for not churning out enough successful bilingual students. Now, why do you think that really is? Well,
I think part of it, again, is that it's the system is sort of set up a fairly unfair way of measuring its own results. Mm-hmm. That you get a lot of people who go through the system who are perfectly capable by the time they graduate to speak in French. But what happens with a lot of kids is they drop out in grade 10 because of another problem, which affects immersion students more than others, but affects all of our high school students, that we've got such rigid requirements at the high school level, so few opportunities to take electives, and students make an entirely rational choice. If I'm going to be forced to take this subject and this subject to be able to apply for university and get my diploma, and I can't make French work in that, I'll take the course in English, especially because, as I was mentioning, with the shortage of teachers, often there's more of a variety of courses available in English. So you look at some other countries, you use the UK as an example. There you get kids who start off in their sort of middle school age, and they're doing a dozen or so courses at the same time. And they do a set of exams at the end. In their last 2 years of school, they focus in on 2 to 4 courses, and that's it. So you think about that compared to the way we do it, where we're still trying to get people who may have no interest at all in the arts or the sciences, but in high school we're still trying to get them to take these graduation requirements, and they've got nothing to do with what they want to do with their life. And so I think one of the things we can do there to make the current immersion system work better, and I think high school work better for every student, is to really relax some of those requirements and say, no, you've got to be doing well in school and taking courses, of course, but being so prescriptive, telling people exactly what classes they have to take, it doesn't fit with the research that I've read. It doesn't fit with what students need, and the universities and community colleges, that's not what they're looking for either. They want to have students who are ready to get into post-secondary and go on to excel in those studies. Or for students who are leaving school, why aren't we opening up our schools to offer more opportunities for students to learn trades and other get prepared for the workforce as well, something that we've stopped doing altogether the last 20 or 30 years in New Brunswick.
Now, French immersion programs started popping up in the province in the late 1960s, and there's a belief that this program is effective until sometime in the late 2000s. Now, do you think people are pretty much remembering that wrong?
Yeah, I think the challenges have been there consistently. At the beginning, the challenges were more trying to roll it out because it was very popular, and it continues to be popular. Every year, more and more parents want to enroll their kids in French immersion because they see it as being a high-quality education, and there's a lot of truth to that. I think though that we're seeing at the same time some of the challenges I was mentioning with teaching staff and just the teachers we've got are great, but there just aren't enough of them, and they're being stretched further and further. And I think that's going to be adding to people's concerns as we go forward. So I think that's dealing with the teacher shortage is a big change. That we used to have lots and lots of teachers, now we don't have nearly enough. And this is a shortage that affects all of North America, so it's not just a New Brunswick problem. So although we can take a bit of comfort and say that's not just us, it also means that it's going to be that much harder for us to recruit, because then it gets into the broader issues around attracting immigrants to New Brunswick and how do we get people to move here. And in the province, how do we make sure that people want to become teachers? Because part of the problem has been that teachers have a job now that's, I think, pretty different than it was when I was going through the system in the 70s and 80s. The level of respect teachers get is vastly reduced. The challenges they face in the classrooms are hugely increased. There's an expectation now that teachers perform a lot of the functions that parents have traditionally performed. And some of that's not, I don't think we can blame that all on parents either. You've got people working full-time, working into the evenings. There's not that time to parent that was there in the up to the 70s or so. So I think there's always a bit of a tendency to romanticize the past, and I'm pushing 50 and I notice myself doing it and try and check it in myself. But I think there have been some changes that have made immersion more challenging. But I think those are just the canary in the coal mine of a school system in general that's facing increased challenges that we haven't yet come to grips with, which is a lot of the stuff that I'm trying to do with reforms in the department now.
Now, you mentioned how some people will drop French immersion by 10th grade because there's electives that they have to take as requirements in order to graduate. Yeah. Within the new immersion plan, is there anything that is there to rectify that so that's not happening as much?
Well, my hope is that that's going to be across the board, the graduation requirements, not just for immersion in the Anglophone sector, but for French and English students, full stop, that we're going to change that. Because there have been discussions inside the department for a long time around this, because this has been seen as a problem, and they just hadn't been acted on. So this is one of the things I tried to do when I came into the office, was talk to people. What are the things you wish a previous minister had the, whatever you want to call it, either the guts or the foolishness to try, that you haven't been able to get out there. And this is one of the ideas that came out pretty quickly, was, look, we've got to do something about high school. It doesn't make any sense the way that we're doing that right now. So that's, my hope is we'll be able to get moving on that, because that's a change that I hear teachers complaining about it, I hear parents, and I certainly hear it from students.
Yes, going to my own personal experience through that high school educational system when it came to French, I was never immersion, but I was English, but it ended at 10th grade as a requirement, and even going into 11th and 12th grade, I thought it was weird, because since New Brunswick is considered a bilingual province, shouldn't it be a French be a requirement maybe up until graduation?
Right, and that's part of the oddness of it, is that we talk about it as though it's the center of our education system, but we don't give it anything close to the level of importance in the end that we do math or English for English students. So surely that should be the way we look at this. And you look at some of the European countries where they have better results. People do the language courses all the way through school, and it appears to have better results. So I think that, yes, we've got the problem with teachers and the numbers, and my hope is there that we can also look at some tools around technology where we can shared classes and have remote teaching and things like that, because that might be a way to help deal with the teaching shortage. And because speaking to your experience, it does not make a lot of sense that we say that we're officially bilingual province, and then even our supposed flagship language program basically sort of washes its hands of the students and says, well, the last couple of years, do what you want. And again, we then get the results that we see, not just for folks like you who weren't in immersion, but for the immersion students too. And so we end up with these very low success rates, because the system is not really set up to succeed. So that's one of those things where I think we have to look at. But there's always been such a fear of talking about immersion, because it pushes those political buttons. And you get, this fight last week started off with one of the party leaders saying, oh, I think this is great, we're getting rid of immersion. No one was planning on getting rid of immersion. It was entirely made up. But that's good. It's good for a certain political constituency. The Liberal leader came out the next day, said exactly the opposite, that it would be terrible that the government was getting rid of immersion. And you had 2 out of the 4 parties in the legislature having a fight over something that was literally not true. And I give the Green Party leader, Mr. Kuhn, some credit for coming out and saying, excuse me, that's not what they said. And I think that looking at things to improve them makes sense. I want to see what it looks like before saying I like it, but I'm not going to be closed-minded about it. And I think that's exactly the sort of approach we need, especially in a minority legislature. Let's just look at the evidence, look at the facts, stop being hysterical and creating political controversies. I mean, it's not the way to create good policy. It just divides people.
Yeah. Now, you were speaking about how we're facing a problem with numbers of teachers that are able to provide these services for students in French. Now, is there any like answer in sight for the near future about how to fix that?
Well, the answer to that is one of those other areas. It's interesting looking at just the way government's structured.
Yeah.
That I'm the Minister of Education, Early Childhood Development. My responsibility ends at grade 12. It's the Ministry for Post-Secondary Education, Training and Labor who's responsible for the universities. But the universities have academic independence, as they should. But a principle of academic independence that was developed hundreds of years ago to make sure that unpopular ideas could be protected, which is absolutely something I support 100%. In this case, it's also meant that when it comes to looking at the number of seats in the teaching schools, for example, that we don't have very much influence over that. Fortunately, because there's some fantastic people working in my department, they found out that in the Education Act, there's actually a requirement that the universities have a letter of agreement with the department that defines what a New Brunswick teacher should look like. And so that gives me a tool without undermining academic freedom at the university side to be able to say, okay, this is what we need. You can choose to teach your trainee teachers whatever you like, but what we need in order to credential a New Brunswick teacher is this. And so that's the process that we're now working on in the department to get that ready, go to the universities and have that conversation, which has not happened yet. The fact that the letter is written into, the requirement for that letter is written into the law and it's never being followed to anyone, the best anyone can figure out, is I think another problem in New Brunswick where we've got to take our laws more seriously. I think fewer laws, more rigidly enforced would be my general approach. This is going to be one area where I hope I can leave this job with that loose end tied up and hopefully a supply of teachers ready to teach in the context of 2020 classrooms in the province. Hopefully that can be a small legacy.
Okay, well, we got to cut to break right now. Continue with us as we continue to talk about education in the province. Hello, welcome back to Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we have Dominic Cardy, Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development, with us, and we're talking about education in the province. Now, continuing on what we were talking about, now, you're saying how some schools in the province don't have access to French Immersion. Do you have a specific number or examples in mind of what people that don't?
I can get them for you. I have a terrible memory, so I try and avoid giving off inaccurate
That's
figures.
fine.
But it's there's a significant percentage, and they tend to be clustered in more rural areas. And part of that you say makes sense. There's not as many francophone speakers, and that cuts down on the number of teachers, and perhaps the level of interest as well. So it's not like this is some sort of conspiracy organized in the cities to prevent those schools from having immersion. It's just, but there hasn't been enough of a focus on it. And I think in part because, again, the politics, it just becomes something where if you talk about immersion, it's going to make people angry. It's going to make some people angry whether you're for it or against it. When you talk about changing it, you risk having everyone angry at you. And what I do remember from the stats is that we've got increasing numbers of students who are trying to get into the program every year. Parents want to see them take immersion because they recognize it can provide advantages. And we have an increasing teacher shortage. So those two numbers are going in the wrong direction. And we have greater need at the same time as we're having lowered supply. So I'm hoping we can work to address the supply in the medium term. And again, in the short term, I think we have to look at using technology. I think more cultural exchanges as well, because part of learning a second language is not just learning the grammar. If you do that, I don't know about you, but you're a lot closer to learning trigonometry and other things in high school math than I am, but I don't remember much of it.
Yeah.
If you don't use that stuff, drops away.
Yeah.
And so finding ways to continue to practice and maintain your ability in a language is really important. And one of the things that's really weird in New Brunswick is that we've got these two linguistic and cultural communities. We haven't done a very good job of exchanging between them. And there's been a couple of French writers writing in the Académie Nouvelle and talking the last week or so about how Francophones need to spend more time talking in French to Anglophones, because nearly every Francophone is bilingual, and chances are pretty good if they're talking to an Anglophone that Anglophone isn't bilingual, and a huge percentage of the time they'll just switch to talking in English to be nice, which is kind, but at the same time it makes it even harder, given that we're operating in an English dominant world, for Anglophones to be able to build up their French or to keep it if they've already got it. So trying to come up with ways as well where we can talk to Francophones as Anglo-New Brunswickers and say, look, we need you to talk French to us, and we've got to find opportunities to practice. And this isn't an effort to further undermine French culture, which obviously is always, the feeling is that the more that you expose Francophone environments to English, the more you're going to be washing English away. So no, we're Anglos, we want to be in your French environment, we want to learn more French, speak French to us. Finding ways to do that, having more exchanges. I can still remember going for a week-long exchange when I was in immersion in grade 6, going up to the Acadian Peninsula. I'd never been there before. I grew up in Fredericton, never went up north, never went to a French community until I had that exchange. And I never went again either until I got into politics when I moved home. So finding ways that we can bridge some of those gaps, because there's some cool things that we have in common between the cultures, and we often don't talk about them. And outside areas like Moncton and Dieppe, where you've got a more genuinely bilingual culture and a lot more exchanges, there aren't necessarily a lot of abilities to have those exchanges either, because a lot of people in the province live in overwhelmingly English communities or overwhelmingly French communities. So finding ways that we can break down the walls of education and say, this isn't just about school, it's about us living in our communities, the way we talk to our friends, opportunities to meet and travel and talk to people. So I think we've got to look beyond just what you do when you come into class and sit down from 8 o'clock till 3 o'clock and read your textbooks.
Yeah. Now, several of the last governments seem to have believed that they had the official fix for the immersion program, resulting in changes basically every few years. Now, does this government's plan differ from all those previous plans?
Well, the interesting thing is the previous changes were both made by the same party when they were in government. The Graham Liberals bumped the immersion level entry point up when Kelly Lamrock is a good friend of mine, and I think he did it for some good reasons, that he was concerned that you were seeing a strong class element come into immersion, and that it was only well-off kids who were going into immersion, and we were basically creating a two-tiered New Brunswick where you had kids of the elite went to French immersion. It didn't really have much to do with immersion, whether or not you were learning French. But functionally, it was a separate school system. And but then on the other side, all of the learning around brain science and the way that children learn, it's pretty clear that the earlier you can start picking up a second language, the better. And there, it's not really whether it's grade 1 or 3 or 5. It's really in the early years. 2 to 5 are the years when your brain is really, really open to learning second, third, fourth languages. So trying to figure out ways that we can build on the expansion of early childhood education. Because although the Gallant government switched the immersion entry point back down to grade 1, which caused another huge bout of fussing about immersion, in the end, I think something that I'd like to, rather than focusing on the negatives of that, I'll focus on the positives of their expansion of early childhood education, because I think that's opened up an opportunity to take advantage of the years when it's increasingly clear are much more important than grade 11 and 12 in terms of your learning. Because if you can get the foundations for a whole range of subjects down when you're at what we currently consider the preschool age, if you get the fundamentals set at that age, kids are pretty likely to be able to go through school and do very well in life. If you're waiting until they're 12, 14, 16, you're really climbing up a really steep mountain and making your life a lot harder for yourself as a teacher or someone running an education department. So I think it's looking at early childhood education and the importance of that. I think it's something that we have to do more and more. And again, give credit to the previous government for having expanded that program, something I've been proud to keep in place and continue to expand.
Right. Now, would you say that we can properly gauge the results of a program change if we don't allow it to run for a longer period of time?
That's fair, and part of the problem with the Gallant change, which is why I opposed the immersion change, is that they didn't give it enough time. We were just getting the first results, the first tests coming in. I think the grade 10 tests based on the grade 3 entry point, and they were marginally better than the old results had been. In the end, again, I think that the key is, if you're looking at the evidence, the science is very clear that earlier is better. And especially when we look at that in the context of the teacher shortage, the more resources I can focus in on the years when it's going to have the most impact, that's certainly what I'm most interested in doing. And I'd argue that the difference between the reforms that I'm proposing right now versus the other ones is that, to our earlier conversation, those were changes imposed across the entire system, and they caused panic and chaos. What I'm doing here is trying to create a system where I will provide the political defense for an evidence-based approach. And if the evidence says this new way of doing things works, we'll expand it. And if it says it doesn't, I'll say that it failed. I'll take responsibility for that, and we'll move on. And I think that's the better way of doing it, because if the program can grow organically because teachers and parents want it, it's going to be pretty hard politically for anyone to fight against that. But if there's another change that's pushed through, then people can say the same things that folks in my party have said, which is, oh, look, the Liberals have imposed these changes on New Brunswickers. People would be able to say the same thing about the PCs, and I don't want that. Not just because it's politically the wrong thing to do, but because I think educationally it's the wrong thing to do. Evidence-based decision-making is the best sort of policy. It's harder, it requires more time and political effort, but that's supposed to be my job. So I don't mind people getting mad at me about it. If I can end up with, again, a province where more people can speak both of our languages, I'll be happy.
Now, how long are you hoping to run this pilot project for?
Well, my hope is that if it works, that it'll continue to run for, again, if we started off in the early years, it'll run up and it'll continue to expand throughout the system. So that will be the intention, because immersion and the discussions around second language are just part of what I'm trying to do with a broader approach to changing the way we handle education in the province by talking about personalized learning, by having an individual approach for each student so that we meet each student where they are and figure out the way to help them get as far ahead as they possibly can in the time that they work in the public school system. So language training is just a part of that. So my hope is that we can have that sort of personalized approach where, for example, if you're really good at math but hate English, that we try and use more written math problems so that you can start to build your English skills by doing something you enjoy, which is math, or the other way around. So finding ways to build based on the strengths that each student brings to the table, and do that rather than saying there's a cookie cutter approach where you're all going to be in this program, you're all going to be in this program, and everyone does everything at the same time, which just generally is, it's going to work well for the kids exactly in the middle, but at least behind the kids who struggle, and at least behind the kids who excel. So I think that's leaving far too many kids behind. So there's no reason we can't move to a system that gives more power to teachers, reduces the paperwork burden on them, so they can just teach. And that's how we achieved some of the best results in the history of the province, back when we had one-room schoolhouses and you had all the kids different ages and everything, and a teacher handling it all. Those teachers had authority that teachers today don't have. So we've got to get back to making sure teachers have got the power in the classroom to be able to use the professional skills they went to university to acquire, and not bury them under mounds of paperwork that stop them from being able to do their job.
Now, can you talk about the differences that we usually find results of students in areas where Francophone communities are more present than Anglophone communities?
In terms of, I'm trying to think of some of this. I mean, you generally in New Brunswick see differences between urban areas and rural areas, regardless of the language composition.
Okay.
And it's one of the things that is also frustrating when we get into, you get people who say that New Brunswick schools are the best in the world. And you'll get others who'll say this education system is a total failure and nothing's working. And the truth is sort of in an odd place in the middle, where we've got schools in New Brunswick that are amongst the absolute best in the entire world. We've got schools that send kids who have knowledge of cybersecurity, for example, coding and other skills, who go on to perform at the highest levels internationally. And other schools where we have massive struggles. And that's in a context, too, of a province where we still have a 56% functional illiteracy rate. So there's a range. And the range is often reflected in, again, that bias between better off and poorer communities. And when people from rural New Brunswick talk about being left behind, they've got a point, because we spend a lot of time talking about programs that aren't even available to kids in their communities. If you're in Fredericton, you've got access to the art gallery, the legislature, to universities, all sorts of resources. If you're living in a smaller community, we haven't done a lot yet to plug those schools into the wider world using technology to allow them to access the same benefits that kids in larger centers are able to use every single day. And I think that's something that we've got to be able to look at and take advantage of the fact that we've got one of the highest levels of fiber optic cable penetration anywhere in the world still. Why not use that to be able to allow kids in tiny little rural schools? There's no reason their teacher shouldn't be able to plug them into a lecture by a world expert on a subject, and then they can use their skills in their classroom to be able to put that in the right context for their kids. That's the sort of stuff I'm talking about.
Now, when you look at attempting to change or fix a program like this, what kind of stakeholder input do you get usually from residents, teachers, or experts?
It depends. I mean, I've actually been pretty pleased that, I mean, partly because I came into this job having read a lot and thought a lot about education. So I had a reasonable background in the subject, but not an expert, not claiming to be at all. So I went out and just tried to talk to as many people as possible. And so, what do you think's broken? How do you think we should fix it? And I tried to spend most of my first 6 months in the department doing that. And so obviously you meet with the unions, you meet with the association. The fact that we have a dual education system, so basically although I'm one minister, I've got 2 separate departments. There's Francophone and Anglophone departments operating in the same building, but totally separately. Separate deputy ministers, separate structures. There's more and more sharing now thanks to I'll give credit to a recently retired Deputy Minister, John McLaughlin, from the Anglophone sector, and Gérald Richard, who is now the Deputy Minister at Health, but who was with me for most of the first year. And the 2 of them, in their time as deputy, really tried to bring the 2 sides of the department together in a way that hadn't happened before, which I think is all to their credit. But the folks inside the department, in many cases, you had people in the bureaucracy, you had people in the principal's offices and teachers who not just had good ideas, but in some cases they were actually doing really cool things in their schools, but they were afraid to share them because they thought that they were going against some provincial policy. So a huge number of the ideas that I've been talking about in my time as minister and are reflected in the Green Paper are ideas that are already in place in New Brunswick schools, but you had, this is kind of depressing, teachers and principals having to spend their resources hiding successful world-class programs because they thought that the system wouldn't support it. And I think that's one of the biggest shames of the way that the government works in New Brunswick in general, is this idea that we don't reward success or innovation, and actually it's sort of the opposite, that we expect everyone to conform to some lower standard. So trying to talk to as many of those teachers, making the message, and the premier's backed me up strongly on this, putting the message out to teachers saying, look, you can tell us what you think is wrong. And I've had teachers who have set up anonymous Gmail accounts so they can write to me their ideas. Nothing controversial, not attacking anyone, just ideas on how to improve the classroom environment. But they felt that they weren't allowed to do that. So trying to really build a culture where it's saying, look, it's okay to complain. And I'd prefer if you also offered solutions, but if you don't want to, that's fine. Tell me something that you just think doesn't work. So trying to really reach out in that way inside the province, and then other stakeholders, parents. Because something that I think we often neglect when we talk, we act as though the school system is solely responsible for kids' education. If the kids don't get a founding in values and life skills and others from their parents, they're unlikely to get them from school, or if they do, they're going to be watered down if they're not reinforced at home. And I think we've got to find ways to try and really engage parents back in the education process, because I think education has to be about more than school. Then other than that, talking to academics, experts, internationally as well as nationally and here in the province, to find out what other challenges other school systems are facing. Every area is a little bit different, but there are some broad challenges, issues around behavior in classrooms and the decline of respect for teachers, increase in incidents of violence, for example. That's something that's happening across the Western world. It's not just a New Brunswick problem. So trying to find solutions that are being tried or work elsewhere, that's certainly something I'm open to doing as well. So trying to talk to as many people as possible. So if you just came through the school system, let me know what you think. How could it have been made better? What would have made your time at school more fulfilling and more interesting, given that you see the level of engagements of the average New Brunswick student up in the 90s or so in grade 1, 2, 3, down to 3 to 5% in high school. People who feel engaged in their education. So I want to change that.
Now, are there any concerns that frequent changes to the program, even just with your new pilot project, might have or continue to scare away parents from enrolling their kids or staying in French Immersion? That
is a risk, and it's absolutely something I have to be very conscious of, and why I was really upset about this headline last week by the other party leader saying that immersion was going to be cut, because that's the sort of thing that just creates panic for no good reason. So the same time, there's always good reasons to not make changes, but if we're not getting the results, which we're not right now, then I think it would be irresponsible to shy away from making changes. So I think the Auditor General in her report on education last year did a really good job of pointing out that there had been a massive number of changes over the last number of years. It was I always get the numbers reversed. I think it was 37 changes in 35 years. It might have been 35 changes in 37, but big changes in education. So that most of those failed because they didn't have the appropriate resources to back them up, and they weren't clearly communicated and supported. And in many cases, some of those changes were literally departmental level initiatives. Schools were told to make changes, they just didn't do them. No one really followed up. Nothing ever changed except there was more paperwork added to and more regulations written. What she also specified, though, after that, because the opposition parties love to hit me in the house.
Unfortunately, I'm going to actually have to cut you off right there. We have to go to commercial right now, so continue with us as we continue to talk about education in New Brunswick. Hello and welcome back to Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we have Dominic Cardy, the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development, with us. And tonight we're talking about education in the province. Now, did you want to continue on what you're saying before I cut you off from the break?
Just on the Auditor General's report, that because the opposition parties, and I get why they do it, they focus in on the part of the report that says there have been too many changes and they haven't been properly resourced. But she also goes on to say that there are a lot of challenges in the education system and there need to be changes. And she spells out a process to make those changes. And that's what I've tried to follow, of making sure that they're properly resourced, evidence-based, clearly communicated. And so I've been trying to, every time I come up with any new idea, run it past her in her office to make sure that it fits with that model that she's proposed, because I think that's the right one, and making sure that you can defend your decisions based on evidence strikes me as the way we should run every government program. But in the case of education, because of all those previous unsuccessful reforms, it's even more important, especially because teachers, I think especially, get really spooked when they hear change is coming, because for them, it just means more work, more responsibility, and more hassle in most cases. And so my goal is that, yes, I know that's been the case, but when I talk about change, I'm talking about a change that gives you more power, more control over your classroom, more authority to decide how your students are going to learn, because that's the job you were trained for, not the one I was trained for. And I'm here to give you political cover and protection so you can do your job, so we can make sure our kids can read and write and be functional citizens in our democracy in 2020. So it's, I think the attitude towards change, we can't let previous changes that haven't worked stop us from trying to make things better, because otherwise we're condemning ourselves to an inevitable slide towards mediocrity. If we just say, well, we can't make things better, so the slow slide towards things getting worse, we just have to accept it. I don't buy that.
Right. Now I'm going to segue ourselves over to another topic for education, the immunization bill. Now, in last year's throne speech, Premier Higgs said that the immunization bill would be back in some form with the new changes. Now, do you have any updates on the status of that?
Yeah, so it came back, it got a new number, and got an addition of a use of the notwithstanding clause, which certainly attracted a lot of controversy and attention from the press and from other parties. And my position on this is, as long as we have a bill that protects New Brunswick's children against easily transmittable diseases and against a misinformed anti-science medievalist conspiracy cult, with there's the anti-vaxxers who go around saying things that are just bluntly not true, which are endangering the lives of not just students, but also of their families, vulnerable and sick people, I'm happy. So it seems that there's a growing number of MLAs from all parties who recognize the importance of a bill like this, because they're starting to see, partly because of the discussion around this bill, that anti-vax community and what it's like, and how it does have power and presence in New Brunswick. And the thousands of emails that were sent in, again, all with utter just ridiculous stuff, ranging from death threats to made-up statements to conspiracy theories about Jews. I mean, absolutely disgusting stuff. I mean, absolutely. I've been around politics for a long time, and I've never seen anything at quite the level of sort of weirdness and inaccuracy that I've seen from the folks opposing a bill that is, in the end, working to make sure that we use vaccines, which have a 200-year history of making sure we live to be past the age of 5. It's ridiculous. So it's in the face of that this bill is necessary, and in that light, I think more and more MLAs have come around to seeing that, yes, this is something that we need. I understand why most people didn't talk about this before. People didn't realize this was a problem. But the last year, we've seen anti-vaccination movements be responsible for the deaths of dozens of children in Samoa and the Pacific, a lower middle income country where anti-vax groups got a huge influence, drove the levels of vaccinations down from high and acceptable levels where you would have had protection down to around 30%. Massive measles outbreak, nearly 100 kids die. Just appalling. So I don't want to see that happen here, because I cannot imagine anything worse than being in a government office and having a child die on my watch and knowing I could have done something to stop it. So I'm not willing to let that happen.
Now, the Premier said that some modifications would be made to bring it more in line with the Canada Health Act and consider different types of exemptions. Now, can you share some with us, like some of the exemptions that might not be in the final bill?
No, the only exemptions that are going to be there are the same in the previous bill, which would just be that if you have a medical exemption, and that's the whole reason to have a bill like this. It helps lots of other people across the community and outside of the school system. But one of the main reasons to have a bill like this is there are kids today who can't get vaccinated, who are vulnerable to these deadly diseases like measles and others. And they're not going to school right now because of not unvaccinated kids who are unvaccinated because their parents are choosing to put a false conspiracy ahead of science, fact, reason, and the protection of their neighbors. So that's really the core of this, is making sure that any exemptions to vaccinations are for solid medical reasons. And there are some. If you've got certain cancers, if you're immunocompromised in some ways, there are some diseases that wipe out the effects of vaccines, making you vulnerable to these diseases just at the point when you're recovering from a disease that already weakened you. So medical exemptions are absolutely necessary. They have to be clearly defined. The problem we had in New Brunswick prior to this bill is that we had a philosophical and medical exemption, and so people just went for they just said, well, my kid's not getting vaccinated for whatever reason, and because we basically accepted any exemption, that meant that there wasn't any rigor there at all. So my goal is to make sure that we've got clear criteria for medical exemptions and make sure that the rest of our children are protected. And there's some good news from Seattle, where the government there introduced a mandatory vaccine bill, and there were concerns that it was going to result in lots of kids staying home because the anti-vaxxers like to make it out that they're representing some huge group of people. They're not. It's very clear from polls here in New Brunswick that nearly 90% of New Brunswickers support this bill specifically. So there's massive public support for it. And in a similar case out west of the states, they only had, I think it was 1,000 students across the state who didn't turn up for school. So it was a very small number. I think it might actually be 100, but it was a very, very small number of kids who didn't come to school as a result, and most of them are getting their vaccines caught up. So this is common sense. It's the same sort of protection that led us to say that, look, you've got to put a bicycle helmet on if you're going to go on the roads. You've got to buckle your seatbelts up if you're in a car. Yes, it's to protect you, but if you're the driver in a car, the reason you have to wear a seatbelt isn't just to protect you, it's to make sure you can stay in control of the vehicle and protect the passengers. This is about living in a society, living in a community. I'm generally very opposed to infringements by the government on individual rights. This is an example of a minimal infringement for a huge, huge gain, which is protecting people's lives. So I think it's a compromise worth making, and I think that's why the bill has the support that it does.
Now, you're saying that the only exemption would be medical. Now, how would the process of accepting such an exemption go about? Like, would it be a parent having to give like a medical report or a note from a doctor?
Yeah, it'll have to be a legitimate doctor's letter saying this is why your child cannot be vaccinated. So it has to be quite clearly defined, because unfortunately some of the anti-vaccine folks have actually advocated publicly in Facebook groups and elsewhere, writing forged letters, finding doctors who apparently are willing to betray their medical oaths and undermine public health and the safety of children by writing letters basically for a fee. One of the sad things with the anti-vaccination movement is that the folks from that side will often spend their time accusing people who are supportive of vaccine science and reality of being in the pay of big pharma or stuff like this, when nearly all of the folks from that community, from the anti-vaccine groups, are themselves selling ridiculous products, selling books, health remedies that don't work, et cetera, et cetera. So there seems to be a strong money-making side from the anti-vaccine community, which is sad because what those people are doing is preying on, in many cases, parents who have suffered tragedies. They go after parents who've lost a child, who've had a child who's suffered from a sudden onset disease in childhood. They tell them that it was vaccines to blame, and then they try and sell them stuff. And I think that's just repulsive.
Now, when it comes to the immunization record database for the province, is there an update so far on where we are right now?
Well, yeah, Dr. Russell, the province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, just came out, I think it was yesterday, saying that the database should be up this year, which is great. So that'll give us the ability. I mean, one of the problems with vaccine records, and again, to be very clear, the reason I introduced this bill was not because of concerns over the current state of vaccinations in the province. It was because of the threat of anti-vaccination groups. But we did also have a problem that we hadn't been keeping track of records inside the school system for years, and it was required. It was another thing that was mandatory that wasn't done. That on entering New Brunswick school, you were supposed to provide proof of vaccination. And in part because everyone was getting vaccinated, I think it just sort of fell by the wayside, that there were more important things to deal with. Everyone just assumed that everyone would keep on getting vaccinated, which was a reasonable assumption until the rise of this dangerous movement with the anti-vaccination activists recently. But beyond that, everyone who gets vaccinated, and if you go on trips overseas, lots of countries require different levels of vaccines to travel. People lose their slips. They lose the little folders that they have the vaccine records in. So having an electronic vaccine record system for all New Brunswickers that let all of us know exactly when we need to get our boosters, if new vaccines come on the market that you want to get, knowing when you can get them, all that sort of information is, I think, just really good for public health. So the enormous majority of the population who support vaccines, I'm sure will take advantage of this, and it'll help put us in line with the rest of the country, because we are the last province to create a database like this. So we're behind, but full credit to Dr. Russell and her crew for getting this going.
Now, what would you say the biggest hurdle in convincing people that vaccinations are there to protect people is currently?
Well, it's with most people, you don't have to convince them. I mean, that's the part that's strange with this, is that it's an interesting fight, because there aren't too many times when a government can poll on a bill and you get close to 90% support. Yeah. That's pretty unusual. Most people are convinced vaccines work because they do. And the evidence is 200 years long, and it continues to grow every year. And vaccines are responsible for probably the single reason for the vast increase in human life expectancy in the last decades. And it's absolutely incredible, the benefits they brought. But the problem is the vaccines only work if you have herd immunity, if you've got people, a whole population who's protected, to make sure that vulnerable people within your community can't get sick and then the disease can spread. So you only need a small number of people who've fallen victim to prejudice and conspiracy before you start to risk the effectiveness of the vaccine system for the whole population. So the biggest challenge is convincing the enormous majority of the population who it would never cross their minds not to get themselves and their kids vaccinated, because that's just what you do if you're a responsible adult in 2020. It's trying to convince them that even though this is a tiny group, it's really important that we protect the entire population against the influence that they're trying to exert, because they don't need to get 25, 30, 40% of the population on side with their conspiracy. They only need 5% in the case of measles, for example, and suddenly we end up by opening up the population to large numbers of injuries and deaths. And we're seeing that right now. We're going through some of the biggest measles outbreaks in the Western world in decades. And there is a direct link between that and the rise of the anti-vaccination movement. It's not the disease hasn't changed, our culture has changed. And unless we start standing up for science and evidence and reason, then we're going to continue to see more and more assaults on these benefits that have made us the best place to live in the history of the planet. And until we start recognizing that, which goes beyond this immunization, but very much linked to education, if we don't realize the basis on which the civilization we live is founded, evidence, facts, science, and reason, we're going to lose those. And they're not like those are permanent states. Most of human history, people lived in ignorance and were happily believed conspiracies and passed them around and burned each other at the stake because of them. We're lucky to live in an incredibly enlightened time with all of the flaws that our culture still has, and all the improvements we can still make. But it would be bloody sad if we spend our time right now backsliding rather than trying to build on what we've got or defend what we have.
Now, in your opinion, do you think that most people that are against certain things like this put too much faith in opinion blogs and social media versus actually looking up scientific evidence?
Yes, I think it's an interesting combination. I think two things, and one of them links directly back to education, that the whole movement a few decades ago of around building self-esteem, I think had a really poisonous effect in that it made everyone think that they know everything about everything. And there was that idea that, well, I've been told that I'm special and I know things, and that I'm doing that. If I feel something, therefore it's got validity, and that is an incredibly dangerous idea. And the idea that you or I, without the background in immunization science, could possibly be in a position to be able to enter into an intelligent debate with someone who has spent their life working in that field. And it doesn't mean those people are perfect, but I'm relying on the collective of immunologists to be able to make sure that the science of immunology is ever taken to a higher level of perfection or closer to perfection. But the idea is that I saw someone online today saying, my doctor got 5 hours of training on vaccines, I've spent 4,000 hours researching them online. The idea that that is in any way an acceptable thing to say, or that gives that person any basis on which to make a presentation is kind of sad. So you've got on one side, you've got this idea that everyone has something to say about everything. And then you've got social media, which allows everyone to say something about everything. So two separate things happened. I think an unfortunate social trend in Western countries coupled with technological change. So you had people who had perhaps an elevated sense of their own opinion, coupled with the ability to amplify their opinion. Because it also used to be that if you thought something kind of deranged, people in your village or your town would go, okay, well that's Gary, that's what he thinks, that's fine. Now Gary can go in his basement and go online, and suddenly he's got 10,000 friends around the world, and they've got the ability to get out there and amplify that message. And then you get bad actors. In the case of the anti-vaccine movement, there's a couple of US billionaires who put tens of millions of dollars into this cause. Robert Kennedy, RFK's son, is one of them, who puts huge amounts of effort into this sort of thing. So you get these people who also have absolutely no scientific credentials, but are celebrities. And we're in a culture as well where social media amplifies the roles of celebrities. And you get celebrities who come out. And of course, they've got a bit of an angle on this because they're making money off this as well. You get someone like Gwyneth Paltrow, who is about to have a show on Netflix talking about a wide variety of utterly spurious goop. Yep. And why is Netflix putting that show on? Because it'll make them money.
Unfortunately, we're actually running out of time right now.
Finishing with Gwyneth Paltrow. That's terrible.
We'll finish with Gwyneth Paltrow. Thank you so much, Dominic, for joining us tonight here on the show. Dominic Cardy is the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. Now, tonight we talked about education in the province. This was Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover, and I'd like to wish you all a good night, and thank you so much for watching.